Each man must do his bit.
Welcome to another edition of the Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and on this series of programs, we examine issues of interest to the Guyanese public at home and in the diaspora. And today we look at something that concerns the majority of Guyanese, that is to say, the question of poverty. The poor and needy, we've always been poor. Guyanese have come from 4 different continents, and the majority of Guyanese are now descendants of persons who were brought here to labor on the plantations, and many persons who lived in those plantations, who toiled to make other people rich, produce children who themselves are poor, and the poverty seems to be hereditary. Some people seem to be unable to shake the bonds of poverty, even now that Guyana has become a petroleum state. We are sometimes astonished that so many people remain poor. We talk about being one of the fastest growing economies in the hemisphere, but some people seem to be poor forever. We are poor, their children are poor, their parents were poor, their grandparents are poor, and it seems that the poor always will be with us. I don't think it needs to be like that. I think we could, eradicate poverty. In fact, Guyana is committed, signed on the dotted line, to the United Nations SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. And the first goal under that United Nations agreement is to eradicate extreme poverty and to halve other forms of poverty by 2030. In fact, from the start of 2025, the clock will be ticking to see whether Guyana could eradicate extreme poverty and other forms of poverty over the next 5 years. That should be our goal. That has been accepted at the international level. I must give credit to the fact that Guyana did adopt some form of strategy several years ago, over 30 years ago, under the People's Progressive Party civic administration. At that time, I think Dr. Jagan was still alive. The World Bank proposed a strategy for reducing poverty in Guyana since May 1994. And there was a poverty reduction strategy paper several years later in 2001. And there was actually a poverty reduction strategy secretariat. So we seem to be going in the right direction. And there was a participation action plan, the PAP. So we seem to understand the importance, not only because it was suggested by the United Nations, not only because we signed an agreement, but we seem to be on the right track. But round about 2000, things seem to have run off the rails. And within a few years, the PPP, a very senior PPP official, was complaining. They were still in office. He was already complaining of the poor results of the so-called poverty reduction strategy. And he was asking for recommendations so that the shortcomings could be corrected. So even though I give credit to the PPP for introducing the poverty reduction strategy, the very leaders of the PPP, before that strategy could be implemented, were complaining about poor results and correcting the shortcomings. So why is it that we are poor? Not because of the absence of a strategy. And, we should examine why the strategy failed. Even next door to Guyana and Brazil, the President Lula, only a couple of months ago, he chaired the G20 summit. And that summit ratified a global alliance against hunger and poverty. So you can see the question of hunger and poverty is international, at the United Nations, at the OAS, in Brazil. And we should try to find out why Guyana hasn't embraced uh, eradication of poverty in a more robust manner. And I'm not sure, but you can check it out. I do not even think that Guyana is one of the countries that signed on to the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty that was introduced by Brazil. Only in November 2024, Guyana's name seems to be missing from the list of 82 countries which signed on to that strategy. I don't know why, but maybe you can find out. The aim of that strategy that Brazil has proposed only in November is to implement a sustainable development goals strategy of reducing poverty and hunger. It aims to give political momentum to foster collective action to build, initiatives to combat poverty and hunger. So Brazil recognizes it. So on the continent and in the international community, the question of hunger is one that faces us. And we have 5 years. The clock is ticking. What causes poverty? Well, we know that we were a colony, and that most colonies are poor. The few colonies that can claim to be richer middle income were largely, if you want to call it, the Dominions, Australia, and Canada. But some of the other countries, the average Ghana, Nigeria, British Guiana, were quite poor. And it means that the people in these colonies, former colonies, did not have the means to acquire the basic goods that they needed to survive, to look after their well-being, to survive with dignity. And this is a problem that we have had throughout our colonial history. After we became independent, the two leading parties adopted, well, what was then, regarded as the best means to get out of poverty, that is some form of social development strategy. And this did not work well in Guyana, quite frankly, simply because, many of the Western countries did not support a socialist development strategy. And the countries that mostly supported that strategy were themselves poor and eventually, abandoned much of what was proclaimed in the 60s and 70s. So with the end of the Cold War, some of the so-called socialist countries were literally shipwrecked. Their economies were damaged, and they had to seek a new strategy for survival. So when we speak about the survival of Guyana in that post-colonial period, and certainly in the post-Cold War period, we're looking at means to provide adequate health for people, education, and sanitation, clean water, and so on. Because these are the distinguishing characteristics of poverty. Guyana at present still has a very high and one of the highest rates in Latin America of poverty. I think the World Bank rates Guyana poverty level at 48.4%, which is very close to half of the population actually living in poverty. So despite the boast about the fastest growing economy, we are still poor. At least over half of the Guyanese are poor. And they're actually living in poverty. And when you visit some of those areas, all the tent cities and the squatter settlements, you'll see that this is not the work of one party, or it didn't take place in 1 year. This took place over a long period of time and has never really been eradicated. Look at the Guyanese today. How accessible are the staple foods? And food is a major index of poverty. How much do you pay for everyday food, for bread, for cassava, for eggs, fish, flour, milk, plantains, sweet potatoes, sugar? All these prices continue to rise. I reckon that for a family of five, you need about 100,000 Guyana dollars a month just to pay for food and other monthly expenses. So when you hear about these cash grants, they're not going very far, actually. They're not going very far. By the first month of 2025, most of that will be gone. After 5 years of being a petroleum state, from 2019 to 2024, you get a cash grant, and for them in 5 years, and that will not put food on the table for a family of five for a very long time. My friends, we are a poor people, and poverty is multidimensional. And as I said, it is multi-generational. Poor people are generally the children of poor people, and the children of poor people themselves will be poor. Very likely will be poor. Very few people can break out of that cycle of hereditary poverty. At present, maybe about 7% of our population live on an average of $450 Guyana dollars a day. You can translate that to US dollars if you wish. About 15% of the population live about $765 a day. And about 45% of the population live on less than $1,500 a day. And all of these figures I'm quoting make you very poor, because if you live in Guyana, $1,500 doesn't take you very far in terms of buying, food and paying other expenses. Why are we poor then? There are lots of reasons. As I said, it's multidimensional. One is that the wealth of the country is unevenly distributed. And as you can see, over the last 50 months or so, the two major unions that represent public servants, the Guyana Public Service Union and the Guyana Teachers Union, have been literally brought to a standstill, not because of the lack of effort on the part of those unions. You saw the teachers there out in the sun. You saw the nurses, the public servants, calling for better wages, and you saw how they're treated by the PPP administration. At the end of the day, they got the pittance. At the end of the day, you go on the street for 10 weeks, and at the end of the day, the PPP never budged. When they have their Congress, they put on a skit and make it a big joke. But they have gotten that, we can call it a pay increase. Let us see how far that pay increase will go to relieving poverty. And most of the persons in those two unions, the Guyana Public Service Union and the Guyana Teachers Union, are state employees. That is the problem. They have fixed wages. They can't become contractors and open sandpits. They're working with fixed salaries, fixed wages, and the wages are not high. They are not adequate. So wealth is unevenly distributed. Many, particularly in the hinterland, have unsatisfactory amount of food and drinking water. I know something's being done. When the APNU was in office, we sought assistance from the Brazilians, and the Brazilians sent over their construction engineer battalion, and we started putting down wells in the Rupununi, which was subjected to periodic effects of El Nino, droughts, and also floods. But we helped to stabilize that and put, through the GWI, put a lot of better quality drinking water. And it's being continued now by the PPP. Many of the neighborhoods are unsafe, regardless of what people say crime is done. Well, what I would say is the crime reports are done. But very frequently, you still see some young boys being shot to death, trying to carry out burglaries with toy guns, and you see what's happening in the hinterland, people being stabbed and shot. So many of the neighborhoods are still unsafe. All this contributes to poverty. Working conditions are still unsettled. You see young men, being buried when the mines cave in the hinterland. Uh, because as soon as the PPP got in, they removed the Corps of Wardens. We had established on the APNU a corps which would go and inspect these mines to make sure they're safe and go into the logging camps, the timber grants. But the PPP did away with those controls. You don't need protection. So the workers continue to die. Then there's some unsanitary living conditions and housing conditions. We inherited nearly 200 squatter settlements from the PPP in 2015. Those squatter settlements are not jumpy umbrella, they just happen overnight. It took a long time, 23 years, for some of those squatter settlements to emerge. Many of them are unsanitary, no proper water, no proper drainage, no proper sanitary facilities, no place for young people, young girls and boys to grow up, no playing areas. Then there's the question of justice. We can see what happens now when the police are out of control, and we've had some extrajudicial killings. And then when the courts rule and try to award some compensation to the families, you see the PPP administration fighting down when in cases when it is clear that person has been unlawfully killed, they're trying to stingily ensure that the families don't get any benefits. We see what happens with unbalanced political representation. APNU came out to ensure that local government elections were held. In fact, that's one of the major reasons why the PPP was removed from office in 2015, because they refused to call local government elections after 20 years. And we held local government elections twice in the first 3 years that we were in office before the no confidence motion was brought against us. But yeah, the PPP won. The PPP has a lot of support in rural areas, and they won some of the new towns that even the APNU created. They won many of the NDCs. But the point is that having control of the NDCs, having control of the municipalities in the rural and hinterland areas, does not necessarily mean that there's equal political representation. There's majority political representation. But the whole purpose of local government is to ensure that the people are properly represented. That is gone now. And sometimes we have untrustworthy law enforcement officials. There are very good police officers, very honest, unbribable police officers, but some of them are bribable. At any given time, there are a couple of hundred policemen before the courts. You don't hear about it every day. But many police officers end up before the courts. Things are not being run on a very efficient basis there. But that's another matter. We try to improve access to education and public health. Quite frankly, we did not have the sort of money that the government has now, and we provided, what's now known as the 3Bs, the boats, bicycles, buses, and breakfast that's 4Bs, to get our children in school and to keep them in school. And the public education transport service, PETS, provided buses and bicycles so the children could get to school, and boats in the rivers, riverine areas, provided, good meals, public education, nutrition service. And I would say that access to education improved. That fewer children were dropping out, and more children were achieving better grades. And those better grades didn't come about by accident. We had to work. Many people talk about what is happening now, but we should look back and see what the condition was in 2015. And you could see the amount of work the APNU had to do to bring some normalcy back to education. Now the standards are slipping again. And of course, there's the question of employment. People need proper employment. Yes, we know that the so-called jobs are being created. We can deal with that on another program, but no, many mothers don't want to see their sons, with brooms and buckets, cleaning up the highways. Yes, the people must work for a living, but I think we can make other arrangements and make sure that most of our children get into other forms of employment, which is sustainable. That is one of the reasons why we set up the Guyana Youth Corps. Again, after the PPP demolished the National Service in 2000, when the APNU got into office in 2015, we set back up the Youth Corps at Kuru, and classes started. Young people from all over the country, Amerindians from the hinterland, Africans, Indians, were in the Guyana Youth Corps. And of course, by then the PPP got in and shut it down. Just like they shut down the Bertram College of Education. Oh, who wants to train public servants? Shut it down. Shut down the Department of Citizenship. Who wants to regulate the migrants coming into the country? Shut it down. So this is what happens. Many Guyanese have started to migrate again. And as you know, it is rated by international agencies that about 39% of the citizens living who were born in Guyana have migrated. And that is no secret. Um, and maybe 89% of citizens who have received tertiary education, that is at UG, migrate soon after they graduate. And this is the problem. There's flights from Guyana, my friends. This is nothing. This is nothing new. It has been happening for the last 50 months, and the PPP has not been able to prevent the migration of Guyanese out. Although a lot of Venezuelan migrants, particularly Waro, are coming into the country, immigration, but emigration has continued. That is, many of the migrants are not satisfied with life in the country, and they don't want to be poor under the PPP. The question is, therefore, why does poverty persist in Guyana? As I said, a large portion of the working population, because of our socialist heritage under both the PPP and the PNC, um, are still state employees. And once people are employed by the state, the salaries and wages tend to be not only inflexible, but insufficient. That is to say that, they can't go out and catch a hand, although some corrupt people do that. But they have to wait on the government um, to increase their salaries and wages. Again, things are worse for pensioners. The state old age pension is inadequate. When I got into parliament, the 10th parliament in 2012, pensioners were getting, 7,500 Guyana dollars a month. It was laughable. And we had to fight tooth and nail and to increase the state old age pensions, the SOAPs. And when we left office in 2020, it had already reached about $21,000. Now they continue to improve. Again, it is not adequate. When you speak of the salaries paid to teachers in the public education system, when you speak about the salaries paid to nurses in the public health system, when you speak about the salaries paid to public servants, to soldiers and policemen, to members of the public corporations, you're speaking about the employed poor. Anybody in the public service these days is a member of the class of employed poor. You take a vow of poverty, and that contributes to this cycle of poverty, hereditary poverty. You know, once I engaged with the Public Service Credit Union, and there are stories of public servants who are borrowing money every month or very frequently to pay their monthly expenses, which means that at the end of the month, they now have to repay the loans and they borrow new loans. So they're on a treadmill. They're borrowing to survive. It's not a good place to be. It's not a good place to be. And this is a situation that contributes to the cycle of poverty in Guyana. Situation in the hinterland is worse. Once you pass Fort Island, you go west of Fort Island, everything west of Fort Island is more difficult than the people living east of the Essequibo River. Life west of Fort Island is very, very difficult for the majority of the residents there. Regions 1, 7, 8, and 9, the Barima Waini, the Kuyuni Mazuruni, the Potaro Siparuni, and the Rukununi regions. And that is where the majority of our indigenous people live. And that is where poverty is most intense. We have a national poverty rate of about 38%, 39%, nearly 40%, living on less than $1,000 a day. We are perhaps among the highest poor population in the Caribbean and Latin America in terms of poverty, the highest rated population of poor people per capita in the Latin America and the Caribbean. That is our national poverty. Nothing to boast about. Nothing to boast about. The question is, where do we go from here over the next 5 years? It will be very difficult, my friend. It will be very difficult for Guyana to eradicate extreme poverty by 2030, in line with the United Nations, commitment to Sustainable Development Goal number 1. I'm not talking about the 16, there's 17 goals. I'm talking about number 1 goal to eradicate extreme poverty by 2030. We are not moving fast enough to get there. And because the government is not focused on poverty eradication. It is focused on, bridge to Suriname. It is focused on Conversation Free Road. It's focused on Cemetery Road. It's focused on, new building for Kanu. It's not focused on poverty eradication. That is the fact. It's focused on buildings. They look good. And when elections come around, you'll see the buildings and the posters, but they will not show you the poor people on the pavements. We need to do several things. One, we need to do what the APNU started to do. And it's very brief. Don't forget, the APNU was only in office for 3 years because the AFC man supported a vote of no confidence. Now he's a contractor. And in 2018, we got in 2015. By 2018, the writing was on the wall. And of course, 2019, 2020, we're just waiting on GCOM to say when. But we got no money. All the taps were turned off. We couldn't get access to oil money. But while we were there, we had a plan. We not only declared the National Day of Villages, but we invested in a rural economy. And you have to invest in the rural economy. That's where the majority of Guyanese live. That's where the majority of Guyanese live. It is the rural economy which will generate wealth for the people who live there, as well as for the country, to promote growth and to create employment. And that is where you start your poverty eradication. We tried and succeeded in increasing production because don't forget, towards the end of our tenure, we had to deal with the COVID pandemic, and production was seriously compromised. But we tried to improve production and improve productivity. We introduced the RSE, the Regional Agriculture Commercial Exhibition. People came out without thought about party and all that. I've been there. We organized them at Linden, at Lethem, at Region 5, at Anna Regina. The Regional Agriculture and Commercial Exhibitions stimulated production. The READ, the REAP, the Regional Entrepreneurial Agriculture Program, the REID. It seems that, as soon as we use the word R, the PPP took offense and refused to support them. But all of these programs should now be strengthened or reintroduced to support the rural economy, to increase production. Infrastructure is needed. Yes, farm to market roads. Yes, everybody wants to drive, along Conversation Tree. You want to go along some promenade. They look good. But farm to market roads, up to now, we don't have a proper bridge on the Essequibo River. We're talking about bridging the Curtin River. But every day, there are problems in the Essequibo River. A few weeks ago, you saw the army truck fell into the Essequibo River. Can you imagine? The biggest river in Guyana still does not have a bridge. And you're hustling to build a bridge to Suriname. We need to build roads. Yes, in due course, we'll improve the cemetery road, improve the Conversation Tree road. But right now, we need farm to market roads in Region 8 and Region 9 and Region 7, Region 1. That is not where infrastructure is going. Infrastructure is going in beautification. We'll have beautiful pictures when the elections come around. But those pictures will not show the true face of poverty. We need to prioritize infrastructure, which improves production, and will contribute to eradication of poverty. We need to implement programs. Yes, hampers are good, cash grants are good, but we need to invest in people's economic production and productive activities. We need to ensure that the older folk, the elderly folk, are provided for in the old age pensions. And they too have become a significant section of the poor. We need to institutionalize the very programs which have been thrown out of the window. The regional agricultural commercial exhibitions, bring them back. They serve the purpose. We need to reintroduce the Rural Agriculture Infrastructure Development, RAID programs, bring it back. We need to reintroduce the Regional and the Rural Enterprise and Agricultural Development Project, READ, bring it back. We need to reintroduce the Regional Economic Agriculture Insurance Program, REAP. Now, it's even CARICOM has hijacked the acronym REAP. But APNU did have an REAP during the COVID, but now that has been thrown out of the window. These programs, the RAC, RAID, READ, and REAP, were not ornamental programs, they worked. But because they were introduced by the APNU, the PPP has gotten rid of them. And that is the story of the PPP. It must have its own stamp. If they don't approve of it, whether it's working well or not, they get rid of it. My friends, the state has an obligation. It's signed on the dotted line. International community has put the eradication of poverty as its number one sustainable development goal. This is not party political propaganda. This is international. Even Brazil has introduced the Global Alliance. The PPP government in Guyana, the People's Progressive Party Civic Administration, is the first government of Guyana to have the sort of access to petroleum revenues that is enjoying billions of dollars. The PPP should now reconsider how it's going to use the people's money. That is, I call on the PPP to revisit the poverty reduction strategy and to reestablish the secretariat. It needs a secretariat, it needs an engine, it wouldn't happen by itself. It's like, unless there is an engine, the vehicle wouldn't move. When APNU was in office, we actually created a Minister of Rural Affairs who pushed the food program. And I would suggest too that the PPP considers establishing a Ministry of Food. Some other countries have a Ministry of Food. Yeah, they use the four-letter word. Don't just hide the word, Ministry of Agriculture and the blah, blah, blah. We need a Ministry of Food that is going to emphasize food security. for poor people particularly. Poor people's survival is going to expand employment opportunities in farming. Reopen that youth corps so that young people could do farming. We must engage in the economic restructuring, particularly in rural areas and the villages and the hinterland. And we must energize equitable economic growth. My friends, Guyana needs to focus more intensely on eradicating poverty. And I recommend these measures. Revisit the poverty reduction strategy, reestablish the poverty reduction secretariat. If you don't want to establish a Ministry of Food, I believe that the Ministry of Food would be more focused in eradicating poverty so that we could restructure our rural economies and ensure that poverty is eradicated by 2030. We can make it if the PPP administration just showed that it had the will to really eradicate poverty rather than getting involved in a lot of beautification projects. We need to put people before profits. And I'm sure that we can eradicate poverty, extreme poverty, by 2030. We can, we must, and we must continue to put our efforts in that direction. Thank you, and may God bless you in 2025, and hope that by 2030, we are more prosperous and less poor. Thank you.
Let us go offering for the young. Let us go offering for our land. Let us resolve to fight together.